When I look back now, I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise like a memory waking up. I was 12, and sleepovers were still a badge of bravery. Sticky pizza fingers, whispering secrets, daring each other under blankets. Mason's grandmother lived in a house that smelled like old lace and lemon oil, a place where the wallpaper had been the same since before the war, and the front porch light hummed in kind of a tired, kindly way. During the day, the yard and the little park that threaded into the backyard felt safe enough. We ran and chased and hid among oaks and low swings. By sunset, the same trees grew teeth. Her spare bedroom had 2 twin beds, and that's why Mason's house became the place to crash. After his grandmother made us linguine and clam sauce, she scooped the pasta into bowls with hands that moved like history. We begged and begged to be allowed back outside for flashlight tag. The week was October, when the air tastes sharper, when shadows arrive earlier than you expect. She relented. The porch light dimmed for us like permission, and we ran back through her back gate toward the little park. A clump of trees, a dark field, a pocket of things that were neither neighbor's property nor fully wild. It was my turn to seek. I stood by the shed and counted, voice hollow and flat in the yard, 30, 29, 28. We'd made rules. No going past the creek. Come back when you hear the horn. Childish, ceremonial. I took the last number and pushed open the back door. My flashlight cut a clean white river through the dark. Its beam trembled from the adrenaline in my hands. I swept the immediate hiding spots, under the picnic table, behind the overturned wheelbarrow, beside the shed where the shadows pooled, and then the woods answered with dry, stepped sounds. There, a flash of motion at the tree line. I trained the light and froze. At first, I thought it was a coat hanging on a low branch until the beam revealed a full shape, tall, impossible to be human-sized under that drape. Someone had thrown a sheet over themselves and tucked through it so it wrapped like a ghost in a child's costume. 2 crude eye holes, 1 small mouth hole, and the white shroud hung like a pale flag against the black. When the light hit, the sheet turned, and the cutout eyes fixed on me. For a ridiculous second, I felt the old, naive relief. A friend playing a joke and called, "Mason? Is that you?" Mason yelped from deeper between trunks, his breath a ragged sound. "Run!" he screamed as he burst from the underbrush. He was already moving, the kind of sprint that erases thought. Whoever had been under that cloth did not follow. They melted between trees, or simply evaporated. We ran for the back door like small animals, breath loud in our ears. Mason's grandmother slammed and locked everything with the kind of decisive clack adults make when they wish to reassure children. She kept telling us we were safe, the words the thickness of a carved bar, and her hands shook a little when she checked the deadbolt twice. That night the house felt wrong in ways small and electric. We lay in our twin beds and talked about nonsense to fill the space between heartbeats, about who was stupid enough to creep through yards at night, about who would do such a gross prank. Midnight came, and the house softened into quiet, but soft sounds are easily amplified in that liminal hour. A few faint thumps from the upstairs hallway drifted down like someone dropping a book. Mason and I exchanged looks and, Because bravery is performative at 12, we assumed his grandmother had just shifted in bed. Sleep found us eventually, but it was shallow and rehearsed, like a play you practice until your voice goes hoarse. In the pale morning, she knocked on our door. Sunlight made the room feel smaller, sharper. She walked in and looked at us with an expression I can still taste. Part anger, part worry. "Who opened the upstairs window?" she asked. We both said we hadn't. Small trembling chorus. She didn't believe us. She walked us up the narrow staircase, past family pictures where everyone's eyes seemed too well lit for comfort, to the spare room upstairs. The window hung wide like a mouth, the brittle air from outside curling the curtains. We repeated ourselves. Not us. Her face tightened and she moved to the bed. With a sound like someone finding something you hope you'd never see, she reached for a crumpled lump of fabric tossed on the mattress. A sheet, filthy with smudges and a smell that pushed at my stomach. She unfurled it and held it flat. The light from the window revealed 3 holes, 2 eyes and a small mouth, as jagged as if cut by a child's clumsy hand. In the center, one of the eye holes, there was a faint, dark smudge. My skin went cold. We told the story about the figure in the trees. Her reaction was a mixture of a woman protecting her order and a woman who had seen things grown dangerous. She didn't call us fools, she called the police. The officers who arrived performed the kind of polite search that the law allows. They swept rooms and asked questions with pens poised. They found no one hiding in the rafters or under floorboards. They explained the entry later. Someone had jumped off the backyard railing onto the awning, opened the upstairs window, and slid in. The logic was almost clinical and therefore more terrifying. A person with a plan who knew how to bypass simple locks. I didn't spend another night there. Mason's parents took him home, and his grandmother stayed with him for a few days. The police said there was no sign of theft, no forced doors. They left, and the house that had felt like a safe island went back to being a place that could be entered by a step you didn't hear. The scarier thought, the one that settled and stayed, wasn't that someone had gotten in. It was the idea they might still be inside a closet, under an unused bed, or wedged in an attic corner that the search missed. I remember that small sense of violation like a physical bruise, how the house kept its polite light and yet had a place where it could be breached. Even years later, when I picture the sheet with 2 eye holes and a mouth ripped into it, the image is not funny. It is the exact shape of a thing that waits just beyond the comfort of your porch light and knows the rights of entering unnoticed. For weeks after that morning, the world felt like it had been rearranged by small hands. Mason's grandmother kept the house on a short, brittle leash. She double-checked locks, wedged extra bolts under the sliding door, looped a chain across the back gate. She moved with the steady efficiency of someone reasserting order. Laundry, tea, firm refusals, when friends asked if the boys could come back over, but the edges of her calm had frayed. I watched her at the sink one afternoon, hands deep in suds, and it was like seeing a thin armor flex. She'd put the sheet in a plastic bag and left it under the sink. Every time the cabinet creaked, I imagined the 3 holes turning to stare. The police did what policemen do. Polite questions, diagrams, and neat handwriting. The single line about method of entry that turned into a fact you can file away. They showed us where footprints on the outside railing probably were, explained that awnings and low attic windows made for easy climbing, and promised increased patrols in the neighborhood for a few nights. Those nights came and went with a corridor of police lights, a couple of houses down, and faded like the rest of the town's sympathies. The official record closed. My chest didn't. At school, I tried to keep the stories small, the way you package a bruise so adults won't pry. But at night, the yard's silence unraveled. I would imagine the person who ducked through the window making use of the spare room, folding himself in the closet the way you fold a map into a pocket, learning the routes of steam from the radiators, training his breath to sound like the pipes. Every little household noise mutated into possibility. The thump of a settling beam became boots. The faint scratch of squirrels on the eaves became fingers on glass. The house had been breached, and I couldn't stop rehearsing the angles of that breach. A week later, unable to sit with the fuzz of unease, Mason and I went back during daylight with a flashlight and a childish insistence we were being brave. His grandmother offered us hot cocoa and a thick look, the kind that means both gratitude and worry, and then she watched us go, a tiny sentinel on the porch. We told ourselves we were checking for evidence that the police had missed. We were also checking for courage. The first time I pushed the attic hatch open, the smell hit like an apology. Stale dust, dry cardboard, the old house sweetness of curtains that have never been washed. The attic was a dim auditorium of insulation and forgotten boxes. I swept the beam of the flashlight across trunks and old holiday ornaments. Nothing moved but a thin family of dust motes. I felt foolish and relieved all at once, the relief like a patch of warm sun under clouds. Then, in the guest room itself, something caught the light behind the radiator. A small smudge on the wall. A smear of dirt high enough that an ordinary thief would not have bothered. The dust there was disturbed in a way that suggested hands, quick prints that had been pressed and dragged, and the spatter of mud had the identical texture of the tiny globules we'd seen on the sheet. Mason stared at it too, his face going something pale. We tracked the smudge down to a faint scuff on the window frame and, just beneath it, a single dry leaf wedged in the sash. It was the sort of trivial thing police reports never take the time to note. A leaf jammed under the lip where a sleeve might have brushed it in climbing, folded into the living memory of a man moving through the house. We found another thing in the back shed, a twisted length of rope, knotted crudely, tucked under an old tarp. It wasn't a crown jewel clue. It was gritty and ordinary, the sort of thing a child might use to swing, or a gardener might use to secure a load. But the knot, an awkward, impatient stitch, was the same stitch someone might make if they needed a rope quickly, and had never really needed a rope before. Maybe he used it to climb up, Mason whispered. The word ascribed shape to my fear in a way that tightened my throat. That afternoon, our bravado collapsed into the kind of quiet that prefers to be left alone. Mason's grandmother, who had already done enough to make the house feel less penetrable, offered to have a friend stay over the following week, and not a second more. She made me promise to call if I saw anything odd. I promised, and my promise felt like a small, fragile bridge. but promises are lights you carry until they burn low. That night, sleeping in my own bed with the ordinary hum of my mother's late shift pumping through the house, I still dreamed in the voice of someone else's patience. Footsteps over wallpaper, a socked foot shifting on a floorboard. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth and the image of the sheet's eye holes hovering under my eyelids. I checked every lock along the route I knew you could take climbing into a second-floor window. I slid a chair under the latch on my bedroom window like a child inventing defenses. The house stayed quiet, in the way a held breath is stillness with a future in it. But the tiny traces we'd found, leaf, smudge, rope, quietly insisted on being read. They arranged themselves into the outline of a presence that might have chosen to become part of the house rather than just pass through. The scariest thing, I realized, wasn't the figure under the sheet. It wasn't even the idea that someone had crept through a window. It was the possibility that the person had learned the room so well they could be invisible inside them, sleeping inside the insulation banked under rafters, tucking a blanket into a gap between boxes, listening to the house breathe and learning how to mimic it. Every creak after that sounded like a voice rehearsing itself. Sometimes the terror was a false note, a raccoon moving through the neighbor's bin, a branch tapping the window, and sometimes it was a private truth that could not be explained away. I kept my flashlight on the bedside table, and the weight of the unknown pressed at the back of my neck like a hand you can't quite see. The weeks dissolved into a steady ache of vigilance. Mason's grandmother tightened her routines into a ritual of small defenses, a chain on the back door, a broom laid under the window latch at night, a garden light left on until dawn. We were children pretending to be adults, practicing the motions grown-ups perform when they want to make a house feel safe. But ritual is only a comfort if it's shared, and fear refuses to be shared evenly. The thin, embarrassed silence at school widened into an invisible boundary around the house. Friends stopped asking to come over. Parents whispered about bad luck and shut the subject with a laugh that didn't reach their eyes. The attic visit had given me something to hold, a dirty leaf, a smudge, a rope proof that the world had been trespassed. Yet proof is a brittle thing. The police wrote their notes. The patrols came 2 nights in a row. And then life made the same call it always makes. Move on. Days piled into each other. Homework, baseball practice, the low chorus of afternoons. But at night, my head rewired itself to attend to the house in ways it never had before. Every creak of settling wood read like someone testing a seam. The radiator hissed, and, against my better sense, I imagined a sock sliding across floorboards. A month later, when the house had quieted enough that my courage frayed into curiosity, Mason and I went back after dinner. His grandmother stood on the porch, hands folded like an anxious sentinel, and watched as we circled the yard with flashlights. The trees threw our beams into narrow ghosts. The park beyond was a fabric of black. We climbed the back railing and examined the awning where, weeks before, a person had stepped like an animal remembering a route. My flashlight found scuffs there, thin abrasions on the metal edge, the kind marks a climbing shoe would leave. It was an ugly little certainty. Someone had used that exact gap to come inside. We kept looking. In an old tool chest under the back stoop, we found a tightly folded scrap of the same sheet we'd seen hanging in the trees. A corner, frayed, still smelling faintly of the same rank thing that had made me gag that morning. Some fool might say the sheet had been planted as proof. Adults might claim kids make myths into evidence, but there it was. A white triangle folded like a handkerchief, an object that refused to be explained away. Mason's grandmother held it in her gloved hands and said nothing. Her mouth made the shape of someone swallowing something bitter. The most unnerving discovery came later that night when we turned on the spare room lamp out of a cat-like need for brightness. Taped carefully behind the wardrobe was a small faded photograph, a grainy Polaroid of two boys at a school picnic, smiling with mouths full of fries. Someone had creased the corner and tucked it behind furniture where dust could keep it. The faces weren't ours, but the picture had the same recognitions that make you feel exposed. Children you might have known, or children who looked enough like children from someplace you'd been. Whoever had placed it there hadn't left some deranged trophy. They had left small human things, evidence of someone learning the rhythms of a family. We took everything to the police station the next day. Unlike the first visit, the officers listened like people who had time left to care. They dusted for prints on the awning, photographed the sheet, and took the Polaroid as if it were an artifact in a quiet inquiry. A detective with tired eyes said they'd run the fibers and check for DNA. For the first time since that night, the hollow in my chest filled with a tentative, brittle hope that someone was paying attention. The lab results were never something I learned in full. Months passed on the calendar, and the precinct's calls were thin. An update here, a polite, "We're still working on it" there. The neighborhood held its breath, and then exhaled into the usual complacency. But the small things kept happening. A porch light that blinked at 1 a.m., muddy prints on a heat grate that disappeared by morning, the soft suggestion of a footfall in the hall when the house was otherwise asleep. Each time, my first reaction was older and sharper than fear. Documentation. Note the time. Call the neighbors. Take a picture. Keep the proof that the world is not as simple as we want it. Years have a way of smoothing raw edges. Mason's grandmother eventually moved closer to family. She was tired of being watchful and decided the loneliness was worse than any single indignity. The house was sold, and the new owners painted the porch a jaunty blue and replaced the old awning. People move into houses and bring with them their own rhythms, their own tolerances for creaks. The park stayed the same. Trees, grass, a swing that still sighs when the wind crosses it. I returned once as a teenager, older and more careful. A different family had more lights. Laughter and a dog running loose pushed the dark back in ways it hadn't been when we were children. Still, some things don't leave. The sheet's jagged eye holes live in my memory like a cut on the map of a place I thought I knew. I sometimes picture the man, the person who used the rail and awning, the one who tucked a Polaroid behind the wardrobe, not as a monster in the movies, but as someone who learned a house in the dark and then put himself where the quiet was thick. That idea is worse, because it doesn't give you the neat relief of a villain who vanishes. It gives you a neighbor with patience and the skill to be unnoticed. On certain nights when the moon is low and the trees throw hard-edged shadows, I imagine a figure moving in the park's periphery, a small, careful silhouette that makes the bushes whisper. I imagine them learning which floorboards creak, which windows are easiest to push, how the light falls across the guest room in mid-morning. The thought tightens the throat in a way nothing else does. You realize the danger is not always in the break-in itself. It's in the possibility that someone can become the architecture's quiet resident. They live in the margins, folded where we don't look, breathing through the house like a second clock. The final image that refuses to settle is simple and small. The sheet, folded and smudged, with 2 eye holes and a mouth hole like the remnant of a child's costume, left under a sink where the house keeps its cleaning tools. It looked, for a moment, almost domestic, like a rag or a potholder, until you remember what the holes were for. It is the ordinary thing that carried the intent to watch. It is the idea that someone once made themselves into a shadow giant and learned to live inside a family's privacy. That notion sits like a stone in the throat. Not cinematic horror, but the small, enduring terror that someone may still know the steps that take them into your house while you sleep.